evening and welcome to Arts Etc. I'm Kathleen Baker. This evening we will be musing through history. The muses who will accompany us today are Calliope, the muse of heroic poetry, and Euterpe, the muse of music. Both our lady muses are very pleased to have an exceptional guest this evening. George P. Carroll has made major contributions in historical music in the last several decades. Well, not that many decades, George, but you did get started early, didn't you, in Nova Scotia?
That's right.
How early did you pick up a drum?
Well, I remember seeing a Highlander marching over my head. I was a short young man at the time, and looking at the bottom of the drum and seeing the snare snap the head. So I must have been 3 or 4 years old, I guess, when I was impressed by military music.
And you joined a unit fairly early in your life, didn't you, in
Nova
Scotia?
I was a child during World War II, and I served with the Royal Canadian Air Force Aircraft Detection Corps as an airplane spotter when I was about 11 years old in 1944. And I remember I was in the Sea Cadet Corps making the VJ Day parade. Playing a bugle. So that I started off marching in a Navy uniform very early on, yes.
Extraordinary. And then you joined the Black Watch Band.
Well, there's a
Did
little,
you not?
I had to grow up first.
Aha,
Right,
well, fill us in.
And learn how to play the drum.
Uh-huh.
I taught myself mostly. There were no instructors in my hometown, and I didn't have a whole lot of funds to take lessons anyway. So I remember taking an old chair and getting the rungs out of a chair, getting a coffee can, and getting a drum book, and I just took the drum book like it was a Bible, read every word like it was literal, and practiced. And I must have practiced properly, because when it came time for me to audition to join the Royal Canadian Navy, I was able to pass the audition, and that started my career of military music.
That's remarkable. You have always been in military music, but for a while, were you not in symphonic music in Canada as well?
Well, military music today in Canada and the United States, and all armed forces bands, you have to play more than just band music, just marching music. You also have to be a dance band musician. And I was very fortunate. I had an opportunity to play with the Halifax Symphony Orchestra and to teach at the conservatory in the capital city of my home province in Nova Scotia before I came down here to the United States. And all my career, I always tried to play all kinds of percussion instruments in many different fields, not just martial music and not just doing research into old style playing.
Military bands in this area, in metropolitan Washington, have a tremendously high reputation, and I know you have been affiliated with them and are called on them in many regards. And one of your earliest relationships with them was with the Army, wasn't it? With the Old Guard. Tell me how you got from Canada to America.
Well, by way of band, I actually, when I was a lad in Nova Scotia, I used to listen to the Navy Band, the United States Navy Band, on the radio, broadcasting as they are tonight from the sail loft of the Naval Gun Factory in Washington, D.C. It was a very fine band, and still is. And I was very impressed by the sound of that band music, and one day I wanted to be good enough to be able to play in one of the service bands in Washington. So I went by way of 5 years in the Royal Canadian Navy bands, ashore and afloat, and then in the Black Watch Canadian Regimental Band for 3 years as the drum sergeant. And on the last part of my tour in the Black Watch, they loaded us up on airplanes and sent us down to Washington to be the band of Queen Elizabeth when she visited Washington. So we played at the British Embassy and did a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, and we played at Fort Myer, the home of the Army Band. So I trotted over to the Fort Myer band room at the United States Army Band, still wearing my Black Watch uniform, and auditioned for the U.S. Army Band. And
was that in a kilt?
Yes. It was a full Black Watch uniform.
Of course.
Right.
No doubt making an impression in some regard.
Well, I didn't know if they thought I was crazy or sane or what, but I passed the audition anyway. So the last day I was in the Black Watch, I was on leave. It was the day I joined the U.S. Army Band. I was in 2 armies on the same day, actually, legally.
It was legal?
It was legal, right. I was on leave from one, so I just joined the other one on the same day.
I see.
So then when I was in the Army Band, there was a great deal of interest in trying to do something in a ceremonial way other than just the United States Army Band in Washington, at Fort Myer. So they want to start Drum and Bugle Corps. So my input to the whole thing was, I said, well, if you want to start Drum and Bugle Corps, it's a little late for the Old Guard, which is the infantry regiment at Fort Myer, kind of the ceremonial troops of the United States Army. It goes back to 1784, the oldest regiment in the regular service. So I said, you really need a fife and drum corps. And for once, they started listening to the people in the lower ranks. And so they said, all right. And like they used to do in the Army, if you complain about the food, they made you the mess sergeant. So they said, well, since you know so much about fife and drum corps, you're going to start one. So that's how the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps gets started. A little more to it than that, but that's basically how it got started.
That's remarkable. Was Hugh Curry the director at the time?
He was indeed. He was Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Curry, and he was the commanding officer of the Army Band. Now, the Army Band, as you know, is one command at Fort Myer under the Military District of Washington, and of course the 3rd Infantry is a completely different organization. I was sent over along with 2 other good individuals, Ron Lozier and Bob Shepard, from the Army Band to work with the 3rd Infantry to form a Fife and Drum Corps. And the Army Fife and Drum Corps, the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps as it exists now, is the result of what we did some 25 years ago.
And you just celebrated that anniversary recently at Fort Myer.
Well, they did. I wasn't there. Unfortunately, the same day they celebrated the anniversary of the 25th anniversary of the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps starting, was the very day that they had the reactivation of the 29th Infantry Division. And now I'm the bandmaster of the 29th Infantry Division in the Virginia National Guard. And we had a very full day because I had 2 bands, the Baltimore Band of the Maryland Guard and my band had to mass together and do all the ceremonies. We started at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we're still playing some music at 12 o'clock the same night. So we had a very full day.
So even though bandsmen are not involved in warfare, the work is extremely hard.
Oh, bandsmen are involved in warfare. Every soldier today in the United States Army is prepared to be involved in warfare, and they're very, very serious about it. So the bandsmen are taught to fire the weapons and to do all the kind of training that any other soldier does in the military. So actually, I got to get a plug in here for bandsmen. Besides a long, good history of bandsmen in combat, today people look at bandsmen as being an unnecessary expense in the military. But actually what's happening is the taxpayers getting double their value because every bandsman in the armed forces of the United States today is also completely trained to do any other thing that a soldier is required to do and to play the instrument besides. So they're getting a double bang out of their bandsmen.
I'm glad you brought that up, and it brings me back to the question of when you were recruiting for the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps, where did you find your fifers and drummers?
Well, we had a young lieutenant that was the officer in charge of the whole operation. And, you know, usually in the Army they Shanghai a bunch of people, or they used to. They don't do that much anymore.
They call it volunteering, don't they?
Volunteering.
Yes.
They used to call it volunteering, right. And I said, you and you, you're going to volunteer to be truck drivers and hand them a wheelbarrow or something, you know. In those days they did that, but I talked this lieutenant into really having the people volunteer for this, and it really happened that way. We took about 300 people and interviewed them, and I impressed on him that it wasn't going to work unless we had people who really wanted to do it. Out of those 300 or so individuals that we interviewed, we got approximately 80 people who really wanted to play the fife, drum, and the bugle. And so once we got the individuals who wanted to do it, then we got the instruments, and I started to teach them along with the help of the other individuals from the Army Band.
Were these people who were trained in music previously?
No, they were regular soldiers, regular infantry soldiers. Most of them had no musical training, or very little. And within 3 months we had them playing, I think it was 8 tunes on the fife and half a dozen tunes on the bugle, and some standard beatings on the fifes, on the drum parts. We'd borrowed some uniforms from the Washington Recreation Commission that were made in 1932. Had 50-cent fifes, borrowed drums, I think $2 bugles. It's changed quite a bit since then.
And the people who play, the soldiers who play fife and drum, are they still soldiers who arrive for regular service and then find this opportunity, or do they come to be part of the Fife and Drum Corps?
They come from various backgrounds now. They recruit folks for the Fife and Drum Corps now in the United States Army. And they have a high quality musician that comes into the Fife and Drum Corps. And most of them stay. It's a good career. The musicians that play fife and drum today are highly qualified musicians and they are what they call special bandsmen in the Army. They have a military occupation specialty as special bandsmen. Like all other bandsmen in the military, they have to do a certain amount of soldier skills too, but they are basically musicians now.
And I want our viewers to know that it was this corps that was seen as the program began this evening, crossing, of course, the creek up at Lexington and Concord Bridge, as a matter of fact. Well, your beginnings of groups is not limited to the U.S. Army. There's also farther south in Williamsburg, Virginia, with which I know all our viewers are very familiar. We're so fond of Williamsburg up here, and it's just a few hours away. You started a fife and drum corps in Williamsburg.
Yes, when I was involved with the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps, I visited Colonial Williamsburg and let the folks down there know that we were busy getting a drum corps together. And they were very interested at that time in getting something similar going. They didn't have an organized fife and drum corps. They had a couple of fifers and drummers playing down there. And they're starting a militia company. So they got me to come down on weekends when I had some free time and give them some consultation work and some instruction. And then when my time was up in the Army, they hired me full-time, and I spent about 10 years at Colonial Williamsburg forming the Colonial Williamsburg Fifes and Drums, which is still going. And then we had also an 18th century band of music playing original and reproduction instruments. And this took a lot of time and effort and research, but it was a lot of fun to work with.
And that is salutary work. There was no other band playing original instruments in America at the time, wasn't there?
No, at that time it was as they say today, the cutting edge. We were pioneers in that field. We didn't have any serpent players we could find, or people to play the Baroque trumpet or the clash pans or any of the old sounding names and the old sounding instruments.
For people who are worried about playing a serpent, could you just describe it to us, George?
Well, it's kind of the grandfather of the tuba and the sousaphone in the Army military bands. It was a cross between a woodwind and a brass. It's a pity we don't have one here because it looks like a snake. It's black, usually, and curvaceous. It goes back and forth and curls around, and it has a brass-type mouthpiece and a woodwind-type body. And so it's a really a hybrid instrument, a combination brass and woodwind, and sounds more like a cow than it does like a modern band instrument. And
it doesn't sound like a serpent.
No, I don't know what a serpent sounds like, but as far as the animal is concerned. But the band instrument was actually the first kind of wind band bass instrument. And to show how crude it was, we used to have a gentleman who demonstrated it by ascending the scale with the fingering while descending with the lip. So he'd go down with the notes with his lip while making the fingering for going up the scale at the same time. It didn't make a whole lot of difference. The fingerings didn't really do a whole lot for the instrument.
I see.
Yes.
Well, in organizing the groups and being, as you say, an originator or a pioneer and on the cutting edge of these matters, there has to be a lot of research that goes into these areas. George, research, publications, and recordings have been one of your major contributions to the field of martial music and early American music. We have a number of pictures of some of the publications that you have published over time for fife and drum and orchestra. I know I have seen some of your arrangements and indeed participated in some of your music making, which is extraordinarily delightful to make and wonderful to listen to over time. Can you tell us how you came to be doing the research and publishing the Drum Major's Handbook and collections of music such as you have?
Well, I don't know how far you want to get, Kathleen, but basically it's the books like we're showing right now were compiled from various and sundry sources: the American Antiquarian Society, private collections, the Canadian Archives, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian. In those repositories are various and sundry fife, drum, band, orchestral music books. And if you go through there with a fine-tooth comb, you can find the kind of material that you're looking for. You have to alert everyone. I was fortunate to know a lot of the members of the Company of Military Historians early on, and they acted as a kind of a network and supplied me with a lot of good material. The Bruce and Emmett book that was on the screen there is one of the books I got from a Company of Military Historians member. That was pretty early. One of the recent books that, of which the drum major's drawing was on the screen a little while ago, I just found it recently. It's in the Canadian Archives, and it's a collection of almost 1,000 fife tunes from the period of the American Revolution. It was a British fife major, and a little bit later into the 19th century. And it's a fascinating work. It has a lot of tunes in that work that I've never seen in any other collection. So all the time, research is being done to find out more new material on this old phenomena.
And are there others who are participating in this research in the country at the time? Or are you doing some unique research in this area?
Well, I like to feel that I'm making a contribution, but there are others who are working equally hard. No one's doing it as a full-time occupation. I don't think, at least I've never found anybody who's doing it all the time, unfortunately, because there's an awful lot of work to be done. There is a gentleman on the West Coast by the name of Jerry Heermans who's doing a lot of writing. It seems like he's a full-time writer, the amount of letters he turns out. There's a Canadian, Bill Nagel, I think his name is, up in Toronto. Drum Major Moon, who took over my job down at Colonial Williamsburg after I left, is doing some work on research. And there's some people in the Corps of Drums Society in England who are working on the British aspect of this. There's a Canadian organization that maybe we'll talk about later and show a picture of that started very early in living history, as we call it today, as you know, and reenactment of the 1867 British Army in Canada at Old Fort Henry up in Kingston. And they're doing a good job of emulating the British Army from that mid-19th century period.
In compiling the research and organizing the papers and preparing music for people to play, do you have to rewrite it? Do you have to arrange it? What do you have to do to it?
Well, there's what I like to think kind of jokingly, you can go into the woods only halfway, then you're coming out. That may sound a little bit oblique to the situation here, but if you take this music and do too much to it, it no longer retains its originality. You can take fife music and arrange it for 8 parts, but then it sounds like a huge calliope. It does not sound like the way it was originally intended for 1 or 2 fifers. Most of the fife music was pretty basic, and they did sometimes write 2 parts in the way of harmony. But the fife itself is such an instrument that if you get too low in the range, it doesn't do well. It doesn't speak well, and it doesn't project well. Then you have to cut down the number of drummers you use so you can hear the fife parts. Now, all these things are being done. They're not authentic, and I guess it becomes a subjective matter. If you like to sound that way, then you're welcome to it. The old fifers and drummers didn't operate that way. Now, on the research of the drumming, the fife parts were written in modern notation because notation was well known in the early days back in the 18th century. Drumming, however, had not really surfaced as a written discipline because the orchestra was well in the 19th century before drums were really being used other than kettle drums in the orchestra. So the art of writing for drums was very crude in the 19th century, and every drum major who wrote his own little book of instructions on how to play the camp calls and such and the different lessons for learning to play had his own way of writing, his own tablature or his own phonetic system. Now, I've been able to take many of these early drum books and translate those early systems into a readable notation that modern drummers can learn and can play. And I've done this in about a dozen different books.
And you have brought this evening a fife and a drum with you.
Right.
And I wonder if you would be good enough to show us the fife, and how many notes can it play?
Well, it can play almost 3 octaves of sound. The bottom range is flute-like. I'm not a fifer, but I can give you a rough idea. And this is the range that I mentioned to you is a little bit low for projecting outside. This is an outside instrument, it's not a parlor instrument. That's the bottom range right there. And it goes up another couple octaves.
A familiar tune.
A familiar tune, right.
Lovely.
It's simply a cylinder of wood, or sometimes metal, plugged at one end with a cork and drilled with 7 holes. 1 hole to blow across as a basic fife, flute-type instrument, and then 6 holes to finger, and you can get approximately 2+ octaves of music from it. And it was very cheap to produce, and it could be, the fingering could be learned in a sequential fashion by a young fellow and picked up fairly fast. So it was a good instrument to produce for the military.
And there were young men who were taught how to make the tunes on the fife in order to send out the orders into the camp for the soldiers.
Yeah, the youngsters who were taught were mostly of tender age. 10, 12 years old was not unusual at all. Usually in the British Army, tradition was the sons of the sergeants and the officers of the regiments learned to play the instrument and became fifer and drummer boys. And this started well before the 18th century and well into the 19th century. They're still using just young children, actually, to play these instruments. There's only over 40,000 fifer and drummers in the Army of the United States during the Civil War, and most of them were a very tender age. Now the drum, of course, of this period was of good proportions. It was a long cylinder of wood. It had skin heads, calf skin, which this one doesn't, this particular model doesn't. It has skin heads, and it was struck with a pretty heavy gauge drumstick.
Ah, yes, that's substantial.
Right.
And how do you hold drumsticks?
Well, the left hand is held in this fashion between the thumb and the forefinger and resting on the second knuckle of the third finger. The first finger coming over like this. And the right hand stick, there's a couple of ways you could hold it. Mostly it was through the little finger, around the little finger, and like this. And the drumstick were placed in the middle of the drum head, and the drummer was enjoined to play just in the center of the head, bringing his sticks all the way up above his own head like this when he was learning to play. If you'll hold those for a minute, and I'll strap the drum on and play a few taps for you.
Oh, surely. Excellent.
Okay.
As the program was beginning this evening, we had a reveille playing. It's not the reveille that all of us have heard.
Well, any loud noise in the morning serves as a reveille. If the fifes and drums and bugles didn't wake the troops up, then they fired a cannon, and that usually did the job. Now, this particular drum is very loud outside. I'll try to attenuate a little. Now, the way the drummers were taught to play was to start with their hands above their head, up here, and then they brought the sticks down and played 2 strokes with each hand.
That's a substantial sound.
Yeah, that's called the daddy-mammy roll. The drummers are taught to play 2 strokes daddy and 2 strokes mammy.
Ah.
And there are other rudiments, as they were called, that were taught by phonetic means. Mm-hmm. The paradiddle sounds like the word paradiddle. Now, I played the long roll to begin with. There were short rolls as well. They went by numbered strokes. A 5-stroke roll just counted 5 strokes with a loud tap on the 5th. They had, for instance, a 10-stroke roll. It had 2 loud strokes on the end. Now, when we put various and sundry of these rolls together in one long line, we end up with such as the reveille, which was a series of 11, 5, and 10-stroke rolls. I'll beat that reveille drum beat for you right now.
I am awake.
You should be.
That's spectacular.
Well, thank you.
And how many drummers were drumming at one time?
Well, in each regiment was 10 companies. Each company had 80 or 100 men per company. There were 20 musicians playing fifes and drums if they were up to full strength. So you had 10 fifers and 10 drummers. And we've tried it on a cold, clear day and tried to find out how far this would carry. You could hear it about 4 or 5 miles away.
That I can well imagine.
With lusty drummers and fifers.
And your work carries on even now in Canada and the United States, George. You have recently told me about your involvement with the Fort Henry Guard in Kingston, Ontario, which you had mentioned earlier is a recreated unit. You are a visiting professor there, did you say? Well,
I call it that. I'm kind of a consultant up there. I go up there and teach the Canadian fifers and drummers, which now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, is the land from whence I came, that the longest lived system of playing the drums and the fifes that virtually unchanged is here in the United States. That's kind of hard for the Canadians to assimilate, for someone to come up there south of the border and indicate that the British today are not really keeping a hold of their old way of drumming and fifing, and therefore they should listen to Americans. A lot of national pride gets kind of put to one side when I have to teach that method. And as much as I came from Canada, I have a small foot in the door. So they are listening to me, and the style of drumming is changing now in the Fort Henry Guard to an old British style. The modern style of playing the drums and the pipe bands is really modern. Although the bagpipes are one of the oldest military music instruments, the drum method of playing them became very modern after World War II. The style was very much influenced by modern jazz drummers such as Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa. And the drummers who I used to kid about this, the drummers today are finally admitting and writing down in their notes that that's indeed where they got their rhythmic input from the jazz drummers in the pipe bands. So obviously this is not the right kind of influence to use to teach historic type drumming. So we go back and hit the old British and American drum books and find out the way these old drummers played. Before I leave the American drum influence and talk about the old Fort Henry Guard any longer, there's a very interesting story locally. In the War of 1812, there's a British drummer that came to Washington, D.C. from Massachusetts. He wrote a drum book, and these drum books were piled up in the War Department, and that's what the British used to start the fire, to burn the War Department when they attacked Washington. It was Charles Stewart Ashworth's drum books.
Heavens. I'm very, very, very moved by that. Thank heaven there is George Carroll to seek out more information and do the research and bring to life, to brilliant life, as we have seen this evening, the fifing and drumming of the early times. I know that our muses are truly honored. I think they have returned here, summoned by the excellent reveilles that George has played this evening. I wish we could go on longer, George. People I know will want to hear your orchestras playing. The 29th, which is the 29th Division in Virginia and Roanoke?
Yes, that's the National Guard Band.
National Guard Band.
29th Infantry Division.
And then, of course, when you go to Williamsburg, think of the beginnings of the Fife and Drum Corps at Williamsburg, and, of course, the beginnings of the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps at Fort Myer in Virginia. Indeed, this has been a splendid evening with George Carroll. What an honor to have you here, George. Thank you so much, and Godspeed to you. Thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening. Happy drumming, happy fifing to you, and we'll see you next time. This is Kathleen Baker on Arts Etc.